Time now once again for the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. Markets, finance, scandals. Oh, we got all the scandals. There are so many scandals. Stacy Herbert, tell us more, tell us more, tell us more.
Here's the first headline. Hans Rudolf Mers. Bunderfleisch, Fleisch, Lachenfall, Bundesstaat.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
And it's the finance minister for Switzerland. And he's speaking before Parliament, a very banal subject of imports of dried beef and whether it's flavored before or after importation.
Yeah.
But as you can see, he finds this hilarious.
Sogenannte Schweizerische Erläuterung.
Okay, and this is all about the importation of dried beef.
That's right.
Like a beef jerky type thing.
I guess so.
And he's got the giggles.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. He's got the giggles.
I think this is indicative of the global state of finances around the world. I think all these guys who are in charge of government finances in one way or another are having a collective nervous breakdown. Finance ministers on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
And Switzerland, of course, is in the center of this global currency war going on, and they're one of the most active in terms of intervening and trying to manipulate the value of their currency, which is soaring because it's considered a safe haven currency, and of course they're trying to stop everything.
Well, the Swiss franc is also soaring because of unwinding of the Swiss franc carry trade. A lot of folks in Eastern Europe use the Swiss franc to speculate in the real estate market. They're getting blown out. That money is going back into Swiss francs, which is driving the price higher, which is increasing the cost of these speculators in Eastern Europe. And there's a vicious feedback mechanism forcing the Swiss franc higher. But the other point I think needs to be made is that the Bank of International Settlements, also located in Switzerland, they've taken a look at their vaults. And they're taking a look at what they own for collateral that is the basis for the global currency markets and global central banking system. And what they see is a mountain of beef jerky. You see, it's all collateralized by beef jerky. Beef jerky is the de facto global currency today. That's what this guy knows. That's why he's laughing.
Much of international finance, monetary and fiscal policy and economic policy are as hysterical as this dried beef is. First headline, as evidence, China proudly demolishing buildings before completed in pursuit of the great housing bubble perpetual engine. These are all photos from China, and they're, as you can see, some very brand new buildings just being demolished because a random property developer decides he doesn't want an exhibition hall, he wants a luxury hotel there. Or, it's government policy, I guess.
Yeah, it's creative destruction, isn't it? That Schumpeterian concept of creative destruction, they're applying it there in China. Why wait even to finish the project? Just blow it up before you even finish it, and point all that to your balance sheet and call it GDP growth.
I want to point out this building in particular, Zhongyin building in Wanzhou City, and it was only 6 years old. It was built in 2004. And it was never put to use because as soon as it was built, it was considered so unsafe to enter that it was known as the local corruption building because something like 43 suspects were sentenced for basically corrupt building practices. But one of the statements that this site says then is solving all of the building safety problems would demand more than the cost of building a new one. So the authorities blew it up. And I thought, that's a great way. This is exactly what Ben Bernanke Hank Paulson, Bush, Obama, all these people should have done. It was so expensive to fix this corrupt banking and financial system. They should have just blown the whole thing up.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what a lot of people proposed. In other words, put all those bad banks, ring-fence them, essentially nationalize them, which is the same thing as blowing it all up, and then start a few new banks that are clean of any of these toxic debts and hire managers who are not tied in with Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, and anybody who has been responsible for corrupting and destroying the U.S. banking system, the global banking system, for the past 20 years. I mean, that's what they could. Obama could have done that. That was an option that he had. But because he's got Larry Summers and Tim Geithner whispering into his ear, he did the absolute worst thing.
Speaking of funny dried beef sort of moments, here's another dried beef moment. EU set secret group to save the euro. 2 months after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the fall of 2008, apparently a small group of European leaders set up a secret task force to save the euro. And this information only came to light when the French Treasury official Xavier Musca was stepping down as chairman of the Economic and Financial Committee, which is an important body in the EU structure. And he left a memo to his successor, and at the end of a long list of things he had to do, he added one more thing. Incidentally, there's a group that doesn't exist.
Well, remember Gordon Brown? He called it the shadow banking system. You know, there is a global shadow banking system, and the money that they control in the shadow banking system is much more than what is reported in the visible banking system. And these bureaucrats and technocrats and folks, they try to maneuver this shadow banking system in ways to help manage the economy completely outside of the tenets of free market capitalism. That's the biggest joke of all. Play the laughing man. That's the biggest joke of all. We haven't lived in a free market capitalist system for 40 years. Not since the U.S. went off the gold standard, and the Federal Reserve and the central banks are managing the economy like this massive, centralized command and control nincompoop committee, and this is just another example of it.
Well, the other thing that's so funny about it is it might as well be a group that doesn't exist, because it's impossible to save these currencies, these fiat currencies. As the next headline would attest to, Brazil's central bank president says no country can hold dollar up. So this is Brazilian central bank president Enrique Morales, and I guess he's being asked to intervene and lower the value of the Brazilian real, which is up 34% in the past year against the dollar. And of course, there's a lot of pressure from special interests within your own country to do something as this race to the bottom in the currency market happens.
Well, it's competitive devaluation, like we saw in the 1930s, because these countries don't have much of an export market in the U.S., I should say. I mean, there's no way to export your way into GDP growth. The only way you can do it is through currency devaluation. So it's like shooting yourself in the head. It's a suicide banker maneuver, as I've been talking about on the show for months. The country is run by suicide bankers. They follow an outdated ideology of free market capitalism, which is the misinterpretation of the works of Adam Smith, and they're basically banking jihadis blowing themselves up for who knows what, nobody can tell, maybe for beef jerky.
But he's also pointing out the reality is that he says that the problem with the dollar falling in value, well, tumbling in value again, is that the U.S. economy is a black hole of debt and disaster. He said there's nothing, we can't print money, we can't buy more dollars than than the economy of the United States is crashing.
Yeah, it's remarkable over the past couple of years, Stacy Herbert. You've seen this unwinding of different currencies as part of the unwinding of the carry trades. Whether it's the Japanese yen, the reason it's so strong is in part due to the unwinding of the Japanese yen carry trade. The same thing for the Swiss franc. When you have zero interest rates, here's the key. When you have zero interest rates, like you do all over the world, it doesn't spur GDP growth. It spurs speculation. And you're talking about speculation committed by the most irresponsible bankers in the history of the world, who often make mistakes and then go to government, put a gun to their head, as Paulson did in the end of 2008, and say, give us $750 billion or we're going to blow your head off. And that was his message.
Well, 0% interest rates also discourages capital formation, which one needs for capitalism to function, because if you can't save, where are you going to go?
Right.
Now, the other problem with this, why it's a beef jerky thing to try to stop the U.S. dollar from collapsing, is indicated in this headline: Bush tax cuts reduced total income by $2.7 trillion. Now, this is about where the Joseph Stiglitz estimated the cost of Bush's wars was about between $2 and $3 trillion. So he cut income by $2.7 trillion and then decided to spend about that much on a war.
Yeah, this is what I never understood. I mean, the U.S. could have simply done a leveraged buyout of Iraq for real. I mean, they should have sent Henry Kravis down there, or Schwartzman, to do.
He wouldn't be complaining these days.
Right. He's all complaining about Bush's, tax programs. I'm sorry, Obama. I get those two confused. saying that it's quite an affront to his sensibilities as a private equity manager. But going back to the Bush years, he simply could have offered Iraq. At this point, he could have offered them $1 or $2 trillion in cash, taken over the country. It could have been the 51st American state, and had a play on the oil reserves, and no deaths would have ensued. And I don't understand. It would have been the cost-benefit analysis would have been. It goes back to the story about the Chinese blowing up the buildings before they're even finished. In other words, if you're going to have a model based on warfare, and the warfare is tied to exploding bombs, and having soldiers killed, and having an outdated Veterans Administration, which is a money pit for a lot of senators and congressmen getting a lot of kickbacks and other dirty deals, you can't have a logical free market approach to your empire building.
And then finally, here's a headline that is the anti-dried beef story. Businessman furious at bank's refusal to lend bricks up Barclays branch in protest. So this is Cameron Hope, a property developer down in Bournemouth in the UK, and he built an 8-foot by 4-foot wall directly in front of the entrance of a Barclays bank in Bournemouth. He was joined by other local business owners who say they have had trouble getting money out of banks in order to run their companies. The protesters waved placards and banners proclaiming, "Robbed by the banks we own." Barclays is partly owned by the UK taxpayer. "And make the banks lend."
Well, good on you, mate. You've got a lot of beef jerky in there to survive on, so have at it. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being once again on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more after the break, so stay right there.
Every month we give you the future. We help you understand how we'll get there and what tomorrow will bring. The best in science and technology from across Russia and around the world. Join us for Technology Update on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to North Carolina to welcome back to the show William B.J. Lawson, the Republican candidate for Congress in North Carolina's 4th District. He has received the backing of Ron Paul. B.J. Lawson, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max. Great to be with you.
All right, B.J. Lawson. First, I want to talk about China. It seems that there is a brewing trade and currency war between the U.S. and China. Last year, North Carolina, your state, exported $1.9 billion in goods to China. A Business Insider lists North Carolina as one of the top 10 states to be harmed by a trade war with China. Your thoughts, B.J. Lawson?
Well, I think that's a great point. And when you look at where we are in this global economy, we need to be restoring honest capitalism and not trying to build walls instead of building bridges. At the same time, China is an easy target because for that one, while we may be exporting a lot, we've also been exporting a lot of jobs. But I lay the blame for much of that on our own domestic policies, where we're taxing and regulating our companies out of business to the point where the nicest building in most small towns in North Carolina today is either the jail or City Hall, and you've got a bunch of boarded up factories and people just milling around outside drinking out of paper bags at high noon. We're in a pretty rough spot here, and I think that the folks I talk to are just frustrated about what's been done to our local economies.
All right, you mentioned the phrase honest capitalism. Presumably that means that we are currently experiencing dishonest capitalism. What's the difference?
Well, I think at the end of the day, capitalism for me is where you do well by doing good. It's where you profit by serving your customers. And what we've allowed our economic system, and not over the past 2 years or 4 years, but this has been generations in the making, to degenerate into this crony capitalism or this corporatism, where really what determines your profitability is how well you access the levers of power in Washington and use those to your own selfish benefit.
All right, B.J. Lawson, let's continue on with the China Question. The Financial Times recently referred to low interest rates on savings accounts in China as financial repression. What can be done to keep the U.S. Federal Reserve from financially repressing the American population of savers through 0% interest rates and endless quantitative easing?
That's a great point, Max. And I think people are beginning to realize that not only do we have a war on capitalism emanating from Washington, we also have a war on savings and investment. And these people who buy into the Keynesian claptrap of sort of the paradox of thrift, they really don't understand where jobs come from. Jobs come from investment. And done right, savings should be investment. So when you take a surplus in one area of the economy and reinvest it and put it to profitable use, those are the seeds that turn into new jobs and businesses. And with the Federal Reserve punishing savers right now and basically pushing us further down the road towards an eventual currency crisis, we're not doing anyone any favors with the exception of the too big to fails who are trying to profit from this game of extend and pretend.
Now, going back to the 70s and early 80s, the U.S. was in a somewhat similar situation. Paul Volcker was the Fed chairman. He raised interest rates aggressively, and it worked, you could say, in a lot of different ways. Why not simply, since Paul Volcker is in advising Obama now he's around, why not simply remember the solution back then and use it again?
Well, obviously there are some different forces at play. Right now, our financial system is caught in a deflationary spiral, and we've suspended reality by suspending mark-to-market accounting. We're trying desperately to prop up asset values so that we can pretend like our financial system is solvent. And this zero interest rate policy is but further, it's but a temporizing measure to try to pretend like we are going to be able to remain solvent when the debt in our overall economic system is well beyond our ability to service it. It's unfortunate that Volcker is not being respected as a voice of reason because he has been extremely honest throughout this crisis about the need to recognize the true causes of what's going on. So not that we don't need necessarily 18% interest rates, but I think at the end of the day what people are realizing is that the crisis we're experiencing today represents the ultimate failure of central planning as it's applied to our monetary system. And people are beginning to ask some really good questions about the role of the Federal Reserve, both in creating this crisis and now in extending it.
All right. So clearly, as these midterm elections approach, the U.S. economy is going to take center stage and probably be a main determinant in who gets in and who gets thrown out. So let's talk about some other solutions you might have, B.J. Lawson, other than revisiting the interest rate scenario and possibly raising interest rates to encourage capital formation. What else?
Well, the one thing that I've come to realize over my life of dealing with our economy is that we have a cancer within our economic system, and that cancer is called the Internal Revenue Service. And it manifests in the April 15th ritual of the income tax. We have got to get rid of the IRS and the income tax. And at this point, I am a strong proponent of the fair tax as a replacement for the income tax because we want more jobs, productivity, and income. It doesn't make sense for us to be taxing jobs, productivity, and income, especially with a tax code that is so complicated, so convoluted, and so, frankly, abused by special interests in trying to carve out their own favors, that we just have basically criminalized capitalism and turned everyone who tries to start a business or grow a business into an unindicted criminal.
Tell me a little bit more about what you see as a fair tax. Is that like a value-added tax? What exactly is a fair tax?
Not at all a value-added tax. And this is it's actually very straightforward. It's been promulgated by a number of folks, most prominently Neil Bortz has written a couple of books on it. But it's the complete replacement of the income tax, estate taxes, and capital gains taxes with a single national uniform consumption tax. It's a retail sales tax that is applied once at the point of sale, just as you currently experience in states that have state sales taxes. And what it does is it makes the cost of government transparent, puts it out in front of the American people, and it stops punishing jobs, productivity, and income. So as a trade-off, while I think we can all agree that our government spends way too much money, but in terms of trying to redirect our tax system towards encouraging us to move from an economy where 70% of our GDP is consumer spending, we need to start building again. We need to start producing again. The way to do that is to get people focused on the rewards of production as opposed to just stimulating the economy through endless consumption.
All right, so of the choices before us, the three being income tax, property tax, and the way you're describing a fair tax, which is a tax on consumption. It sounds similar to a value-added tax, but clearly you're not including the idea of increasing taxes on property ownership, which guys like economists like Michael Hudson would put forth as one of the solutions that he's advocating.
Yes, I've looked into that a little bit. I think the key point for me is having a way of funding the government that is transparent and a system where, frankly, everybody pays something. We've gotten to the point now in the U.S. where fully half of Americans don't pay any income tax. And then the vast majority of the tax burden is paid by those in the highest income tax brackets. And it's getting to the point where it's just being confiscatory to the point where capital is fleeing our shores. And that goes for corporate as well as personal income tax rates. So I think that the key difference between the value-added tax and the fair tax is the value-added tax is applied at every stage of production. So it really is a tax on the creation of value throughout the economy. The retail sales tax, or the fair tax is a retail sales tax or consumption tax, it's just levied at the point of sale, and it only applies to new goods and services. So it doesn't attempt to, say, for example, target sale of used items on Craigslist and things like that. It's just a retail sales tax on new goods that people will then be paying tax on to the federal government as well as to the state government.
Okay, well, I guess the emphasis there should not even be on the word tax so much, but on the word, as you use it, transparency, because
Correct.
So much of the system has become opaque, and this has created hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of problems. Okay, let's ask you about the banking system specifically, B.J. Lawson. Any ideas in terms of fixes there?
Well, I think the most important thing we need to restore confidence in our economy is to restore confidence in our financial system. And where we've gone with this so-called financial innovation and financial engineering over the past couple of decades, my opponent, David Price, voted for the repeal of Glass-Steagall and allowed the largest too-big-to-fail banks to gamble on the taxpayer's dime. This is the kind of corporatism that is absolutely working against the American people. So not only do we allow this idea of too big to fail, and do we reward failure through endless bailouts, which engender tremendous moral hazard, but then at the end of the day, we're further encouraging this lack of transparency by suspending mark-to-market accounting and just lying about the value of assets on balance sheets and allowing banks to, the largest ones, to stash assets in off-balance sheet vehicles where we have no idea what's out there. That's got to stop. If we want to have banks that are confident enough in their position to make loans, and if we want businesses to be confident enough to borrow based upon expectations of future economic growth, we've got to have honesty and transparency in the financial system, and we have to stop legalizing the accounting fraud, in many cases the very same accounting fraud that brought down Enron.
Yeah, on the subject of mortgage fraud, there's allegedly some mortgage fraud by all the major banks foreclosing on homes they don't own. How do you stop this ongoing crime wave? It
is a crime wave, and I'm excited at least to see the judicial system stepping up a little bit and pushing back against this, just this immense flood of paper. And again, this financial engineering happened with a lot of shortcuts being taken through the systems of the chain of custody, what's required to happen legally with respect to documents and titles. All of that had been shortcut in the need for speed in securitizing these loans. That's bad policy besides being illegal, and the fact that we've allowed the banking industry to get away with this for so long is, I think, kind of endemic of the problem. It really tells you who really does own Washington. But at the same time, I do think that there is hope that the judicial system is stepping up and saying, you know what, you can't just claim that you have a title over this property when in fact you haven't followed the proper legal requirements to maintain the chain of control over that title.
Now, what about something really remarkable here? Form 1099 requirement that was slipped into the health care bill. This is just a shocking piece of legislative legerdemain where those who have the special interest serving the banking industry simply slip something into a health care bill. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, and that's one more reason that I am a strong proponent of the One Subject at a Time Act, which says that Congress can't just shove unrelated provisions into health care. The joke here is that they actually were considering this as a measure that would help pay for health care reform, which has tremendous costs that it adds into the system. But the way they're going to pay for health care reform is by requiring all businesses to file 1099 forms for any expenses over $600 in a year. And think about the burden that that's going to place on businesses of every size. I mean, you can be an attorney that spends $600 in office supplies at your local office supply store, and you're having to ask them for a W-9 at the checkout so you can fill out your 1099. It's absurd. But at the same time, I think this has been an illustration to more people in our district that Washington is simply out of control. It's just a bunch of career politicians and Washington insiders who are serving their own interests at the expense of the American people. And ultimately, I mean, what they're trying to do is that they're literally trying to crush the United States economy. It's pretty bald-faced when you say, look, we're going to raise money by requiring you to document all of your purchases over $600 in a year. You're not actually encouraging economic growth and job creation there. You are crushing the economy.
All right, B.J. Lawson, running for Congress in North Carolina. Thanks once again for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure. I'd invite people to visit lawsonforcongress.com, and we look forward to victory in November.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. And I want to thank my guest, B.J. Lawson. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.